running the team and getting into the detail of the tasks and deciding who's going to do what. If they're doing that, then they're going to have not much scope to be able to scale their business. Mm-hmm. And so that is like the number one thing. After that sort of time of like, what's the founder doing?
So hello. Welcome back to the Scale to Grow podcast. I am stoked about this episode because, of course, we are talking about operations again. And I had with me Lloyd, who is the founder of Virtual DOO, and he is very adept in people management, projects and operations, and process improvement. So I was very happy that we had a chance to sit down and just chat about all things operations. This episode is really about how you can scale your business with a fractional DOO. And if you don't know what a DOO means, it's a director of operations. So in most cases, this would not kind of apply to you if you are a smaller business. It's definitely if you have had some revenues under your belt, have a couple of people working under you, and you definitely need an extra pair of eyes, hands, thoughts, everything that can help you to kind of take that pressure off of you. Because when you're at a certain stage, you definitely need to have some form of barrier between you and your ability to kind of have that strategic space. So this is what Lloyd does with his team. And they've done this with working with many different business owners across a few industries. So he's done it in marketing, he's done it in e-commerce, he's done it in the coaching and education space, and he's also done it in real estate. So I'm very excited about this episode. So without further ado, let's dive in and welcome Lloyd to the podcast. So Lloyd, welcome to the podcast.
Shauna, thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, I'm glad that we got to do this. It's not every day I get to talk to someone who spends most of their time in the back end doing operational work and kind of help the machine kind of do its thing.
I do my very best, and it's funny how it's all started. It started with me, and now there's a few of us, and now we're all over the world. And when we were just talking a minute ago, you were saying what it's like being in Toronto, and I was talking about what it's like being in Australia in the hot weather. And then we reflect, I've got a team member in Edmonton. So if I'm talking about it's being plus 25 degrees and it's being minus 25 there, like just how funny it is to have a global team and global conversations.
Absolutely. It's like and the thing is, I love the fact that there's perspective too, because you also get a chance to tap into some of their knowledge of what's going on in their part of the world, especially when you're thinking of business and you're thinking about kind of norms and culture and all the different things that might affect growth, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to ask this question. What are you reading right now? Because I see that you go through quite a bit you have a list of books that you've kind of like cycled through. What's on your desk right now that you're...
So the one I'm in at the moment is The Gap and the Gain, which is by Dan Sullivan. And Dan Sullivan's just produced so many great books. And if I'm going to confess to something, I'm a secret pessimist. So, the secret's out. And so I think sometimes that can be a good trait for an operations leader, because I generally go around expecting the worst. And when it doesn't happen, I'm like, great, didn't happen. I'm so happy about that. But I feel like I've kind of got that sometimes a bit of a negative mindset, and I know that's just not good for you, and I want to fix that. And so I've just read so many Dan Sullivan books now. Like the classic that I often guide people to is Who Not How. I love that book. But The Gap and the Gain is really about mindset, about how you can be in a positive mindset, especially for business owners. That's so important.
Mm-hmm. That's actually really interesting. I don't remember reading any of Dan's books, but definitely will put that on my list.
Yeah, you've got to. Yeah, he's the founder of Strategic Coach. He's like an OG coach, and so many coaches have learned from him. So, you can hoover all those up straight away.
Yeah, no, and especially just the point about, being a pessimist as an ops manager or ops leader. I think if you have someone who's a quick start, especially as a visionary, they need the stability. They need
Yeah.
the grounding every now and then, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of visionaries, they just want to jump out the plane and like build the parachute on the way down. And it's like a good number two or COO, ops lead, director of operations. And I use a lot of these terms interchangeably, really. The difference a lot in my regard is a lot of the time is marketing, but is to keep them in check and say, hey, you're trying to spin 100 plates here. Like, let's focus on 3 that are going to move the needle the most. Like, let's focus on them. Let's look at the risks of doing these things. And I know being an entrepreneur is about taking risk. Like, that's often how they got there. But let's do it in a guided way.
Yeah, 100%. And if you think about kind of resources and how limited resources are when you're at certain growth stages, it's important to have someone like you who actually gives you that reality check and say, I think that's a great idea. What if we do this and verify that this will actually be done within 12 months, like they said it would be?
Yeah. And sometimes, like, given that, hey, let's really work out what the timeline really looks like when we include all of these factors, and they go, oh, hang on a minute. Maybe the other thing that we wanted to do is more important, when they actually get a dose of reality.
Yeah, 100%. So how does it work when you're doing this type of work fractionally versus as a full-time person?
So a full-time operator would be generally salary paid. They might have stake or equity in the business. Whereas for a fractional operator, and I'll speak for my business setup because people might do things differently, we're still going to do the things like lead the team, oversee the projects and operations, and drive process improvement and scale. We're doing it on a retainer. So it's going to be less than hiring a full-timer, and they're going to be typically across a number of businesses. So if it's a team where it's not yet at the kind of scale where they need a full-time operator, so like the area that I sit in is typically they've got a team of anywhere between, say, 7 and 30 staff. If the business owner doesn't have like a number 2 that's running that team, they're dying for it at that point. So that's where a fractional might be good. Beyond that kind of team size, they're going to probably look at getting a full-timer. So if they haven't yet had like an operator yet to run their business, like a number 2 who sits in between that founder and the team and runs the team, a fractional might be a good way to start because it costs less. In my business, it's a month-to-month retainer, so they don't have to worry about giving away a stake or equity in their business. It's pretty low. And then, yes, that person is not going to be full-time allocated, but then they're going to get access to someone who's got experience in running other businesses. They're going to see like similar sorts of challenges. So yeah, they get that trade-off. It's pretty low risk month to month. So when they start getting the bigger teams, that's when they might think, maybe I am looking for a full-timer who's in here for the long haul rather than someone who's going to be looking effectively to make themselves redundant and enable others and try and delegate off as much as possible and enable the team.
I like that. So when you go into kind of a new business or you get contracted into a business as part of your retainer, what are some of the challenges that you see when they're considering kind of, because when they're bringing you on, it means that they're ready to take the business to a next stage. So what are some challenges you commonly see?
The reason that people are bringing us in most of the time is that they're in this kind of emergency land of the founder has been sucked into the daily operations. They can't get themselves out. It's like the emergency department. It's like that game Whack-A-Mole. Like they're there swatting everything themselves, and they haven't yet got an operator who can get in there and take care of running the operations for them, like that one person to run the team. So the biggest symptoms normally, what is the founder doing? Are they working on like the strategy of the business and what it's doing next and chasing after sales? Or are they instead running the team and getting into the detail of the tasks and deciding who's going to do what? If they're doing that, then they're going to have not much scope to be able to scale their business. And so that is like the number one thing. After that sort of time of like, what's the founder doing? The next thing that would be very much related is like, what's happening in the operations? So if the operations is like the war room, it's red alert and everything's really reactive, that's where they're going to need help as well. So kind of like what I was saying about being whack-a-mole, like first thing's like, what's the founder doing their time? The second thing's about operational smoothness. So they're going to get in and like, what things are we measuring in this business? And how do we put in feedback loops so that we improve them? So, what's the sales numbers, the marketing numbers, the IT numbers, operational incidents, and so forth? What are our financials? And creating sort of a dashboard or flight panel of that, of reds and greens, so that when things are red, we're like, okay, why is that red? What do we need to do to make that red a green? Do we need to put in some kind of automation, or do we need to look at the process with the person who looks after that area? Or do we need someone to help that person out? Do they need to hire? Or the other question, unfortunate question, is the person who's in charge of that area the right person in the right seat? So they're sitting there like at that level of looking at across the team and looking at across the dashboard and making sure that there's processes in place or looking into improving them.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final thing that's probably more related to this show and your audience about scale is scaling. So one way to scale, and probably the less interesting but most known, is putting in feedback loops, putting in process improvements, which is in some way quite reactive. But then the other thing, and I've got to say my business has only been really doing this particular thing, focusing on it in the last year, is revenue ops. So that's where you're looking in your CRM and then looking in with sales and marketing and your account manager and looking at ways where you can see if there's opportunities to make money. And that, for me in my business, that's been like the missing piece of the puzzle, because then I find like, well, we put in a fractional operator for you, and if they can help you get your operations under control, great. And they think, yeah, but I'm still spending money on this. But if we can help them make money, it's like, this is a no-brainer, right? There's someone in there, they've looked in the CRM, they found these opportunities, they can see where the disconnect is between sales and marketing or whatever processes. So those are the kind of things that they would focus on.
Oh, interesting. So while you were talking, my first thought that came up was, at what stage do you typically step in? That was one. And two, what does the team composition generally look like? So is it is it just the owner and a couple of VAs or contractors? Like, what does the team composition look like before they bring someone in?
Great question. And I confess, when I started my business, I didn't know who that ideal customer was either. And I just went, I was like, oh, you got a problem? I'll try and help you. But it's become clear over time that if they've got a team of less than 5, unless they've got a big budget and want to move fast, generally what's going to happen is the founder's going to just try and run everything themselves. And maybe they can, maybe that's okay. But when they get above a team of about 7, 7's a magic number, that's when the founder is like, they're trying to run their team and try and treat their business like a product, like, do the strategy and try and chase after new deals. It's really hard. And I like 7 because, so I heard of Jeff Bezos has got the 2 pizza rule. If you can't feed a team with 2 pizzas, then the team's too big. That's it. I mean, I personally can eat 2 pizzas, but the point is the number about above a team of 7, you're going to need to break that up and have someone to run that team. So between about 7 and 30 staff is our sweet spot. And so now how we play in that team is going to vary massively depending on the team, because if they've got a team of 7, we're going to be much more in the weeds of what's going on. So we're, instead of talking at the sort of leads of the team at a really high level and say, hey, what's happening in your team? How's that running? Can you give me the numbers and let's have a feedback loop? Well, if it's a team of 7, we're going to get right into the weeds there with them and just let's get really involved, because they don't really have a team under themselves yet, that kind of level. Now, as we're getting up to 30, our role moves into what's referred to much more in the US than here in Australia as an integrator. So it's more of someone who's sitting between the leads and making sure that their decisions are flying correctly and being like the arbiter who's making sure that, yeah, this is your responsibility. Oh, there's a disagreement here. That's where it needs to be focused. I'm going to hold you accountable to this, so forth. So between 7 and 30 is our sweet spot, but how we run that operation is really going to change based on how big their team is.
I could definitely see that. So if someone's looking to kind of pull the trigger and say, okay, I want to do this work with you, what should they be looking for in terms of selection? Like, they have a team of 7, or if they're like, let's do some min and max. If they're a team of 7, what should they be looking for in terms of an ops person to support them versus a team of 30? Like, will that be 2 different people, or it doesn't matter? It really just...
Yeah. So what I've learned through running this business is it's a little bit like dating. So when I start with a client, normally the way we start is we do an audit, and I ask the client, like, tell me about your team. I might even meet some of their team first and understand what their pains are, what's happening. And then based on that, I try and match the type of operator to their business. So some, it's going to be like they need some real help on putting in systems in place. And so that might be a smaller team, like they don't have onboarding, offboarding systems. They don't, all of the basic stuff, infrastructure that a business should have around that site, they don't have. So I might put someone in who's going to do that. But also I'm looking at the kind of the match in the culture, like what kind of person might gel well with this team. Around about the 30 size, again, it's going to be more like facilitation across a big team rather than down in the weeds of their systems. And generally, like in my business, the people I'm hiring, they can do both. But it's mostly about trying to just find a match for their culture. And basically, one of the mistakes I made early on in my business, I was hiring for me. And that's the way I'd always done things in corporate. Oh, is this person going to gel in my team? But now I've got this extra layer where I have to go, well, okay, there's someone in my team, they fit the culture and values of my business. Now, are they going to match the culture and values of that business and that team? So generally the best way to start, to answer your question, is start with an audit. It's a little bit like a paid audition for us. And then they get to know that the person that we've placed in, and they, the team and the business owner, can go, oh yeah, this is a match, like we want to do it. And what happens a lot of the time, actually, and this happened only 2 weeks ago, is we get 1 week into the audit and then they go, we already know, let's just go. And we're like, well, hang on, we're still going to do a lot of the audit as well, but the difference is going to be that when we see the problem, instead of telling you how you would fix it or engage us to fix it, we'll just fix it, but we're still going to give you an audit. So that's kind of like how we do it. And it's, yeah, as I say, a bit like an audition and get to know the team.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's interesting that that person kind of realized, oh my God, yeah, they should just do it.
They should just do it.
Fix the problem.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I've had people come to me straight out and say, hey, I know the audit is beginning of the engagement and then you go on to implementation, but I really just want an audit. Just, that's it. And a lot of the time they want that because they just want to see if someone else, like they might think they see something and they want someone else to see if they see it. They don't tell me that, but that's quite often what it is. Or they generally just don't know what they don't know. They're like, I'm sure, why are we stuck here? Or I'm sure there's some way we can do better. And they just want an audit. And I'd say a good proportion of those end up going ahead anyway. But then we did one recently for someone who has a really good team, but he just wanted to know if he could do it better. And we found that he was looking at hiring an operator, what we place. And I just said, I looked in the team, and when I interviewed the team and found out like what they're interested in, what their experiences are, we found someone in their team who with a bit of coaching could actually be the operator. Like they already had a pretty senior role in the business, but they actually wanted to step up as well. So it was a win-win. So yeah, generally we start with an audit, and it's a good way to start.
Yeah, that's actually, so that person really did luck out on that, because it's clear that they probably missed the signs of that person actually wanting to step up, because that's part, that is part of the gig as being the visionary too. You got to find the right people in your
And
organization.
in our audit, we ask a lot of structured questions, but the unstructured ones, like the conversational get to know you stuff, there's so much stuff that comes out in there. And the two questions I love asking after I've got to know them and find out what they like to do outside of work. But that's also really valuable, because when you find out what their passions are, sometimes you can align their passions with a particular project. Like in my own business, I've got a guy who really likes socials and video editing and all that kind of stuff. And a couple of years ago, I was doing my own video editing and socials. And I said, hey, do you want to just learn this and take over from me? And thank God, because he's so much better than me. And my old Instagram account, which I'm still there, but is just like the video editing and special effects are diabolical. So anyway, I'm going off on the topic. Finding out what people want is a really, really valuable and motivating. And then the other thing is we find out like what they think isn't working and what they think is working, because you know when they say, oh, this is working, kind of mess with that last if there's a few people saying we like this process. But when they say what's not working, you'll generally find a few people in the team start identifying the same thing. And this is a really good quick win to get the team on board. If the founder's like, oh yeah, let's stick that on the dashboard as well, let's get that done. The team are bought in straight from the get-go of you helping them to make change. So simple things.
So you've done a couple of audits now. So what's like the number one thing that always comes up that's like the sticking point for a lot of business owners?
I think when a business is started, it can start quite loose. So they hire these people and they get them working on stuff, and then they get them working on some other stuff and some other stuff. And then they get to a kind of point where it's really unclear who owns what. Mm-hmm. And this can result in a bit of disagreement. And then what you get is loss of accountability. Like no one really owns anything. So team structure and accountability is a big one. And even if you've got a pretty small team, this can be significant. So like when you've got a really small team, you might have a couple of VAs and you might have some like SOPs, processes and procedures documented. But if you don't say who owns each document, then because of the lack of ownership, then that process, no one really gives it the love and updates it regularly. So what I always do is make sure that there's clear ownership all the way through. And so we go into a business, team structure and accountability, who owns what, making sure that everything is owned is a very sort of typical one. Another one would be team rhythms, like making sure that there's regular catch-ups in place, but they actually do something helpful. Like it's not just hey, let's catch up for a chat. So a team rhythm where they're going to catch up and review their numbers and look for a feedback loop. Like, what are we going to do about this red? Who's going to own it? There's often, we go into really good businesses and they're not really measuring numbers. They're just going about their day. They might have events and campaigns that they run, and they might run a retrospective at the end, but they don't have numbers that they're all looking at. Like they don't have the sales numbers and the market. So people aren't bought in. They can't see it. They just feel like they're doing their job. So I'd say accountability is number one.
It's organic, man. The whole process is organic. What's your problem?
Yeah. I mean, when I hire people for my team, the first lens I look through is like EQ. Like, are they someone who can be empathetic and listen? Because exactly what you've just said, it's like they're going to have to navigate people in the business and like, hey, try and get them bought in and move them in a direction, get them to understand that there's a change and make the change with them. So for me in my business, like EQ has to be like the number one lens and values before we even get started. But yeah, the main things to answer your question, sort of accountability, rhythms, feedback loops and dashboards, really, really common.
Okay. That makes sense because, like you said, when it starts, it's really loose. As long as it works, and and the lights are kept on and we're able to kind of make money, I guess that's what's going to happen. So when you think about kind of the role that you do you find it's different based on the industry or even service based on versus product industries?
So for my business, I'm typically focused in marketing agencies and e-commerce. I would say that's 2/3, maybe even more of my business is focused on those areas. And they're quite similar in the sense that the founder is normally high visionary, really focused on the sales and product development, and then doing stuff like putting in team rhythms and repetitive things just destroys their soul. Like they're not that kind of person. And even the other industries that I work with that are outside of that, similar kind of avatar of a client. There might be, I've had big stage coaches who are on stage and then they have a team of coaches who also coach. So generally that's who I work with. But the same patterns appear again and again. So it's those things where they need help running the team. They were trying to do their job like selling on stage and then they get back to running a team and they might not have had the mental bandwidth to then focus there. And so they do need help putting in the team rhythms, measuring numbers. And so a lot of these aspects, it doesn't actually matter what the industry is. They need someone to say, okay, is there are there vision, are there values, are there roles and responsibilities, are there rhythms, are there feedback loops, are there dashboards, like someone to come in and put all that in together. And then it certainly helps if we work with certain industries because then we straight away like, oh yeah, we know what we're talking about, or we put in a process similar for another business. And while we respect a wall between those businesses where we're not sharing any client information, we can say, hey, we know this process works because we've done it, and we can help them put that process in.
Yeah. So I guess if you're looking at it from the bones of the functional role, everything's kind of the same. It's just like little nuances that might make it a bit different. But if we're looking at like a very inventory heavy business, does that change it for you from an operational standpoint?
So we're working with one customer who's like a huge e-commerce and they've got a number of warehouses. And I think for us, in order to make it work, we're still, because we're a virtual business, like everyone's remote, we've got my team member in Edmonton where it's -20 the other day. They're not going to be able to see what's going on in the warehouse. So that kind of team, for it to be able to work with us, they're going to need to have operations leaders that are one level above that. So for those kind of businesses, it's likely to be a big enough team where for us to be brought in, it's all going to be run remotely. We're going to have installed task management tools and things like that, as opposed to a 100% fully online business. They can be a lot smaller, in some ways easier. But I've said the challenges are common, but then where the pain is often different. But, depending on the time. But inventory business is very complex for sure. Like then you're starting to get into the realms of like, how do you manage cash flow if you're dealing with retail and stocking the warehouse? And that becomes, and it's funny that we talked about a book earlier, but we were talking about Dan Sullivan's books. One of his books is Who Not How. And that's all about finding the who to do the work rather than having you do it. So for a really inventory heavy business, you're definitely going to need to be relying on experts. And sure, you're going to be holding them accountable, but you're not going to know all of their craft. Yeah. And I mean, that's largely the same with most businesses, but in those cases, you're really going to be able to say, who is the kind of person? What are the things that we measure? How do we hold them accountable? And it's great if we have that knowledge at a high level because we work with lots of those businesses. But those kind of businesses, you're going to need a lot of experts in there for sure.
Yeah, I could see that. And I could see more of you understanding the team structure that exists currently and how you would get that feedback loop, because that would be the crux of everything, right? So you can still manage the overhead, but at the same point, if you're dealing with fulfillment centers, you're dealing with different moving parts offline, it definitely will require boots on the ground for that, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're not logging into like their tablet and talking to us on like Slack, the people in the warehouse, but their leader of that warehouse is, you know, clocking back in at the end of the day and saying how it's all going, things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So if someone's kind of hesitant to kind of delegate the responsibility to someone from your team or just like you in general, or to just work with someone external in the business, like what are some of the things that you kind of share with them to kind of not necessarily calm the nerves, but to kind of give somewhat of an assurance as to how you do what you do, and just what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to scale unless you let go of the reins. Like, you're not going to be able to get far. You're going to get stuck in the weeds of your business. Like, you're not going to be able to break through to the next level unless you do start letting go of the reins and trusting people. And that's not just about business. That's about, you know, as a busy business owner, that's about your life. Like, surely there's more to life than sitting and doing your business. Like, what about your passion?
Yeah. Yeah. What if the kickback is, well, I have a ton of assistants. I don't need a DOO.
Yeah. And I mean, if they're super efficient and that team are really autonomous, then great. But what tends to happen is, like, my very first client was an e-commerce client, and he was doing 16-hour days, running on adrenaline, assigning everyone tasks. And then he had a great business, by the way. He was doing very well. But then 16-hour days, how long can you sustain that for? And so he might have been able to get his team to be more autonomous over time by coaching them to be able to own outcomes. But again, as you get above a certain size, you still need someone to bring it all together. So if you're going to be that person who wants to develop their product or their business and work on strategy, then you should really be handing over the running of the operations to someone else. And for that client, what it meant for him is when he was able to, in this case, it was my first client, it was me. I was able to help take that scattergunning off him and just, okay, team, let's plan out what we're going to do for the next 10 days, right? This is how we're going to work together. We're going to have these rhythms and feedback loops and so forth. It meant the founder was able to work on where he wanted his business to go next. And so for him, he was all online at that point, but it meant that he was able to then go after retail. And that's where he is now. He's now got his product in shops. Now, I confess, this particular character, one of the benefits that I'm saying by working with us is we'll get you more time. This guy, we got him out of the operations, but he decided to fill his 16 hours with something else. It was his passion, but he was out there doing video creatives instead to promote his business. He's just a really hard worker. So you can hire someone who can come in and run your operations, but you got to also be that person to sort of decide what you're going to do with your time now when you get it. And if you don't know even what an operator is going to do, then that's why we typically start with an audit. I mean, some of my referrals that have come to me have been, oh, so-and-so recommended you. Like, I really need you. Don't actually know what you're going to do. So I go, okay, well, that's why it's also good for us to just start with an audit. So if you're unsure, like, what are they actually going to do for you? Have someone come in and say, hey, look, this is what your business is now. This is what we could do. But this is how we would do it. So you don't have to do it. We don't have to use us. You could use someone else. You could hire someone else. So an audit's a really good way to start if they would think, oh, maybe, is it going to help at all? And then that final point a point that I said earlier was about sometimes in an audit, we find someone in their team who could actually do it, who could actually be the operator. In which case what they need instead is coaching. And so that's a way where you've already got your team who you trust. So you could just engage someone for a temporary amount of time to say, look, this is how you do it. This is the rhythms that you run. These are the feedback loops you run. And then hand over to your team member, or if you want to bring in someone outside who's eventually going to be a full-timer, that's totally fine. We've done that. We've done both of those things. So yeah, it's really a question for the founder. It's like, how long do you want to be just doing all the operational tasks? Like, if you're doing that, then you're not going to be able to scale.
Yeah, and it's the headspace, right? Because at the end of the day, when your headspace is consumed by all the little things, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right?
Death by 1,000 paper cuts, for sure. Yeah.
100%. So what's next for you, Lloyd?
absolute immediate after this podcast, I'm going for a surf. That's one of my KPIs, but I know that's not what you meant. But there's a
no, thank you.
But there's a truth there in that one of the things I hold myself accountable is, why did I get out of corporate to do this? Because I wanted time. So I am going to go for a surf. That's one of my KPIs, one surf a day. But what's next for me in business, like in the long term? There's a couple of things, like in terms of my own business. In order for this to go to the next level, we've got a nice, comfortable cadence of clients now. But I just think some more on my marketing front, in terms of, I've put out a lot of content, so I'm going to do look into long form YouTube and get some help from an expert. Another example of who, not how, like relying on someone who really knows what they're doing in this area. And I think in 2024, my website also needs an uplift because it looks like it was written in the 90s. So by me. So yeah, that's what's next.
I love it. Okay, so where can people find you if they want to find out more about your services, or just kind of find out what else? Can you do an audit for them? Let's just say that.
Yeah. I always love a friendly connect as well. Like, even if we can't help, even if your team's too small or we're not a match, I love referring and connecting people to find that we can help them in some way. So best way is go to my website, virtualdoo.com, or email me, Lloyd, Lloyd, @virtualdoo.com. And I'm also giving away an operational checklist, so you can download that if you like as well. That's virtualdoo.com/checklists of what to look out for, some of the things that we might identify in an audit. So you can download that for free.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, Lloyd, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of this. Lots of good stuff. And you might make that surf.
I'm heading out. I'm going to check the cams and then dashing out with the board. And yeah, that's it. That's the one. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, it's my pleasure. It was good. I definitely, when it comes to operations, it's really close to me because I've spent years in operations, and sometimes people always come back and say, I don't know what you do specifically. Is it customer service? Do you do this? And when you don't have someone in that role, you can see the visible difference, because
things
don't run as smooth, but they can't put their finger on it because you're doing so many of the moving parts, and they just don't know what to pinpoint, because operations is pretty much huge. Yeah,
it's a moving target. What the medicine you're going to apply is different depending on what the problem is. And
it runs. I always say it reminds me of, like, if you think of like a river, it runs across everything almost. So it's like, it doesn't matter what part of your functional area in your business you're in, everything has to interact with operations. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It has to be there.
Right. The right person is so important. They're going to be across all of the team and moving it forward. Right people in the right seats, so important.
Exactly. Love it. Okay. So we can talk forever, as you can tell, everyone. But I'm going to definitely put everything in the show notes. And if you want that checklist, it's at virtualdoo.com/checklist. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. And definitely, like you said, he likes connections. So reach out, even if your business is not at that stage yet where you have that team composition that he requires to work with him. But like you said, there might be other alternatives in terms of how they can support you if you really need to get more headspace. And something to think about too that we didn't really cover, when we talk about having someone in your business, it doesn't have to be a retainer model. It can also be specific problem areas that they can solve, and they can move it forward so that you can at least get over the hump.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So something to think about. But Lloyd, I'm glad you were here and glad you were able to share this.
Thank you so much.